Hi, my name's Emlyn Pearce. I'm a writer and I've been working with Smajo Beso. He's a researcher at Newcastle University. We've been working together the last few years, writing a book about Smajo's experiences as a child. And today we're going to talk to you about the two countries that we come from and how they experienced or had very different experiences of conflict in the 1990s.
Emlyn and I have one interesting thing in common. We both emigrated to the UK in July 1994 under very different circumstances. One of us came as a refugee from a country that had just experienced a genocide, and the other from a country that had narrowly avoided genocide and achieved a peaceful transition to democracy. Today, we are going to examine 3 reasons why we believe genocide happened in one country and not in the other. So those are leadership, philosophy, and the actions of individual people. In the 1980s, my country was a middle-income European country that had been peaceful since the Second World War. And this is an image of the beautiful Stary Mosto Bridge in Mostar. It was a place where people of different religions and ethnicities worked, lived, and socialized together. This country was an active member of the international community, a leading member of the non-aligned movement, and a host of the Winter Olympics in 1984. And this is a recent photograph of the capital, Sarajevo, where the Olympics were held. Some of you, or some of your teachers, might remember the 1984 Winter Olympics, where Tove Landin became the highest scoring figure skaters of all time. Standards of living were improving, and many Europeans holidayed on sun-drenched beaches there.
In the 1980s, my country was a middle-income African country where an ethnic minority had used violence to dominate the majority for 300 years. It was a country where people of different races were not allowed to sit on the same park bench, never mind live in the same neighborhoods. And this image on the screen now is of a sign at a beach that was reserved for white people. So Black people who went onto that beach would be arrested and taken away by the police. The government had used extreme violence against its people for decades. They had shot unarmed school children, poisoned political prisoners and thrown them out of aircraft into the sea, and plotted to make women of certain ethnicities infertile. And this is an image of, that's an image of Hector Peterson, who was shot dead by the police when he was just 14 years old at a protest in Soweto in 1976. My country was an international pariah. It was subject to sanctions and sporting boycotts, which had severely damaged its economy, and it had been banned from the Olympic Games since the 1960s.
So hearing all that, which country do you think would go on to experience a genocide? The road to genocide is not a single track. Just like real roads, it is a part of a broader network with many opportunities to turn off and end up with a different kind of history. The first country we described is Yugoslavia, where the Bosnian Muslim population was the target of a genocide in the early 1990s. In more than 3.5 years of destruction, more than 100,000 people were killed, more than 2 million people were expelled from their homes, between 20 and 80,000 young girls and women were raped. There are still more than 7,000 missing persons in Bosnia today. People were slaughtered simply because of their identity and the geographic position they occupied. It wasn't enough to just kill people. The physical proof of Muslim existence, as well as the proof of a shared and multicultural Bosnia, was also targeted. So these images from 1993, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that they were from the Holocaust. The second country is South Africa, where a peaceful transition to democracy was achieved in 1994, and potential genocides were avoided. So the first difference that me and Emlyn identified was leadership. From the Second World War until 1980, Yugoslavia was ruled by President Tito. He ruled through an idea of brotherhood and unity. He understood the importance of communities and groups working together to build a shared future rather than working against each other. When he died, nationalist leaders across Yugoslavia scrambled for power. In 1986, Slobodan Milosevic, that you can see here on the screen, rose through the political ranks and came to power in Serbia. He was one that really utilized the populist and nationalist formula. A narrative of division and hate was constructed that began to involve all elements of society. So the road to genocide is never an individual journey or act. It includes and requires the support of the entire society, from the media, religious community, intellectuals, academics, and so on.
In Nelson Mandela, South Africa had a leader who was prepared to put the country's needs before his own, even if that meant spending years and decades, in fact, in prison with no guarantee of success. And this image here is of Nelson Mandela revisiting his prison cell on Robben Island a few years after he'd been freed. Mandela understood something that our current politicians would do well to remember: that lasting peace is the product not of one side defeating and dominating the other, but of both sides in a conflict coming together to negotiate and reconcile. He showed that good democratic leaders represent all of their country's people, not just their own supporters. Outside the structures of politics, the chief non-political leader, who's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he was the Anglican Archbishop of Cape Town during apartheid, was able to construct a unifying narrative that spoke to the spiritual side of the people. His greatest achievement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, provided a way for the truth to come out for all South Africans to understand and acknowledge what had happened during apartheid.
The second difference that we've identified is philosophy. Good leadership must be underpinned by good ideas which are emotionally compelling, realistic, and inclusive. In Bosnia, the road to genocide was built on the philosophy of nationalism. By 1991, Serbian and Croatian politicians were openly equating Bosnian Muslims to animals, insects, disease, and illness. So this is a quote by a former Serbian politician. She was the president of Republika Srpska, and I think this was in 1991, just before the genocide started. Bosnian Muslims that have been living in Europe for more than 500 years were othered. To Serbian or Croatian nationalists, it became completely acceptable behavior to steal, kill, rape young girls and women, and then to go back to their own families, their wives, their kids, and carry on with their normal lives. So there comes a point where ridding Muslims, the disease, the idea of killing another human being, it not only becomes morally acceptable, it becomes a moral imperative.
In South Africa, the road to democracy was built upon the African philosophy of Ubuntu. And Ubuntu says that humanity is one entity. We're like water, and you cannot poison half of humanity without poisoning all of it. Attacking another person, according to Ubuntu, is an attack on ourselves. Desmond Tutu describes Ubuntu thus. He says, a person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished when others are tortured or oppressed. Ubuntu is the opposite of apartheid. It reveals that the fate of human beings are always entwined, even if we try to deny that fact by building walls and creating borders. Here we see a very famous image of Nelson Mandela, who was president by this point in 1995 when South Africa won the Rugby World Cup, and he's presenting the World Cup to Francois Pienaar. During apartheid, rugby was seen very much as a white person's sport. Black people hated rugby; they saw it as a symbol of apartheid. But when Nelson Mandela wore the South African rugby jersey, he showed that South Africans could come together and share things like rugby. And this kind of dream of his was reached its fullest potential in 2019 when South Africa won the Rugby World Cup again. But this time we won it with a black captain. And this image, I think, just really shows the journey that South Africa went on. You see a team of black and white people playing together and winning the World Cup for the whole country. Finally, and most importantly on the road to genocide, individual people still have agency. In Bosnia, many individuals chose hatred and destruction, but others still chose compassion and unity, even in the depths of conflict. In South Africa, ordinary people were prepared to shift their thinking and come together to celebrate their common ground.
The most powerful example of someone choosing compassion over hatred that I can think of was when my mum sat me, my brother, and sister down on the 24th of January 1994. That was the day after her sister had been killed by bombs dropped from a Croatian plane onto Moscow. The most emotionally satisfying thing for her to have said would have been to direct all of our anger at them, to say that all Croatians are the same, that all Catholics or Christians are the same, that they're all murderers, rapists, liars, and so on. She could have protected her pain with a shield of anger and aggression. That is what most humans would have done in that situation. But my mom did something very courageous and different. She told us that they're not all the same, that we can't generalize. She told us that there were good people on the other side, and the best way to resist those who were attacking us was not to become like them.
In South Africa, Babalwa Mhloli, whose father was murdered and had his hand cut off and kept in a jar of formaldehyde in Port Elizabeth police station, asked the Truth Commission to find her father's killers so that she could forgive them. And in 2006, Adrian Vlok, an apartheid government minister, washed the feet of the widows of anti-apartheid activists whose murders he had ordered as a symbolic act of contrition. And we can see Adrian Vlok in this picture here. He now runs a food program in black townships, providing food to children as a way of atoning for the crimes that he committed during apartheid. Ultimately, there is no good leader or powerful philosophy that can prevent genocide unless ordinary people are willing to reach out to each other and to see that our differences are not a threat, but they are actually just a reminder of how much we need each other. Just as travelers must pay attention to where they're going and must constantly make sure that the roads they choose are the right ones, the road towards peace is one that we must constantly search out and aim for. It doesn't happen automatically. The destination of genocide is not reached via just a single road, but through a gradual accumulation of wrong turns. It is the responsibility of each of us to use the maps provided by compassion and understanding to choose the path of peace instead.
Thank you very much for listening to us and giving us an opportunity to share our experience. If you have any questions, you can see our contact details on the screen now. Feel free to email us and we will try our best to answer them. So thank you.
Thank you.